Okay, let's unpack this. What if the stuff we think of as totally separate, like consciousness, the physical matter all around us, even energy, what if they're actually just, different sides of the same coin?
Exactly. And what if there are hints about this hidden connection, like in some really unexpected research corners?
Yeah, and that brings us to this special assignment we got from our partners at Bald Bonkers Network LLC.
Right. They pointed us towards this fascinating set of documents from the Japan Psychotronics Institute. And these papers, they really dive deep into these potential interconnections.
So our mission really is to explore what these sources are suggesting about, well, the fundamental nature of reality itself.
That's it. We need to dig into concepts like consciousness matter, energy triangle, and something called the vacuum hypothesis.
It feels like we're stepping into this kind of wild territory, doesn't it? Where modern physics almost bumps up against some, well, very ancient ways of thinking. These aren't exactly your standard physics papers.
No, not at all. They definitely challenge some, bedrock assumptions about how we see the physical world, especially consciousness's role in it all. And for Bald and Bonkers, and for us doing this deep dive, the main goal here is to really try and grasp the core ideas, how they might connect, and what kind of new picture of the universe they could be painting.
Okay, so let's start with that consciousness, matter, energy triangle. The documents say this idea comes from the chairman of the Japan Psychotronics Institute, and it's apparently gained some traction, even internationally.
It seems so, yeah, which suggests it's maybe more than just a fleeting thought.
Right.
And what's really interesting is how the author connects it back to earlier ideas, like from the English astronomer V.A. Fursoff.
Oh, yeah. What did Fursoff suggest?
Well, Fursoff proposed that mind, which the author here equates with consciousness, could be like a fundamental entity or interaction, right up there with electricity or gravity.
Right.
And the sources even hint at maybe finding a formula, something, like Einstein's EMCR, which immediately makes you think about some deep underlying unity.
And there is a formula in these documents, isn't there? It looks a bit like the gravity equation at first glance. Fg, masses, distance.
Yeah, it starts there with the familiar Newtonian gravitational force. F, Nat G, and arrows RD, that kind of thing.
But then it gets weird with this virtual charge Q. Okay, walk us through this. What's the key idea?
So, right, they introduced this new quantity, Q, the virtual charge. And the crucial part is how they define it mathematically. It's linked to mass, m, and the gravitational constant g. Specifically, Q is g to the power of a half times m.
Okay.
And the author's big claim is that this Q, this virtual charge, isn't just math. It's actually a measure of what they call the panpsychist consciousness quantity.
Hang on. Panpsychist consciousness. So, like, consciousness is everywhere, in everything.
That's the implication, yeah. Panpsychism is that idea. And they're suggesting a direct mathematical link between gravity, this fundamental force pulling matter together, and this idea that consciousness might be inherent in matter itself, even at a basic level.
That is pretty radical thinking.
It is. And the equations they derive from this go even further. We know EMCR connects energy and mass.
Right.
Well, this framework then suggests extending that equivalence to include consciousness, represented by Q. They have an equation E equals MCI being equivalent to KQ.
KQ. What's K?
K is just a constant derived from G and C, the speed of light. So G to the power of a half divided by C squared. The bottom line is it suggests a potential way to convert between all three: mass, energy, and consciousness.
The documents even include a diagram, right? A tetrahedron.
Yes, figure 1. It shows M for mass, E for energy, Q for consciousness, all connected by lines, with G, the gravity constant, sort of central to it.
So it's like a visual map of this proposed interconnectedness.
Exactly. It's meant to show these aren't separate boxes. The lines suggest, possible transformations between them. For Bald and Bonkers, seeing it visually like that probably helps show the sheer scope of what's being proposed here.
And then there's that. Well, that really strange anecdote about the boy bending a spoon with his mind.
Yes.
And apparently the spoon lost 3 milligrams in mass. The source puts this forward as, like, potential evidence for matter actually turning into consciousness.
Yeah.
That sounds, well, frankly, it sounds like something out of science fiction.
It certainly pushes the boundaries of our current understanding, no doubt. You have to take anecdotal stuff like that with a huge grain of salt, obviously.
Obviously.
But within this specific theoretical framework, it's presented as a possible, real-world example of this matter-to-consciousness conversion they're talking about. It's exactly the kind of eyebrow-raising claim Bald and Bonkers wanted us to look at closely.
The documents also mention something about 2 interconnected universes. There's the visible one, matter and energy, and then this oriental view where everything is emptiness. How do those fit together?
Well, the theory suggests that this conversion formula, the one linking consciousness, matter, and energy, is the bridge.
The bridge between
Between the tangible universe we see and touch and this idea of emptiness, which maybe represents some fundamental ground state or pure potential. They're seen as different expressions of the same underlying reality, with consciousness playing this key role in switching between them.
Okay, all right. Let's shift gears a bit. What about this vacuum hypothesis? When I think vacuum, I think nothing. Empty space.
Right, that's the usual picture. But these documents, they describe it very differently. The author proposes the vacuum isn't empty at all. It's more like a seething ocean of virtual positive and negative energies.
Virtual energies, does that connect to actual physics?
It does, yeah. It has roots in quantum physics, specifically Dirac's theory of the electron. That theory hinted at negative energy states.
Which led to predicting antimatter, right? Like positrons.
Exactly. Positrons are the antimatter counterpart to electrons, and the fact that we actually observe electron-positron pairs sort of popping into existence from seemingly nothing and then annihilating each other back into energy, that's often cited as evidence for this underlying sea of virtual energy. It's like they're momentarily borrowing energy from the vacuum.
Okay, I think I follow that part.
So the author takes this further. They suggest the vacuum's virtual energy level is normally full, completely filled. And what we see as real particles, like electrons and positrons, are essentially excitations, like ripples or bubbles, above this baseline energy level.
Okay. So if the vacuum is this huge energy reservoir, what's the implication?
Well, here's the mind-blowing part. Could we potentially, maybe through the action of consciousness, tap into that vacuum energy? Or even remove energy from it? This is definitely something Bald and Bonkers highlighted for us to explore.
And that's the link to paranormal phenomena, they suggest. The idea that maybe consciousness could somehow draw real energy out of the vacuum, that's a huge leap.
It is a very bold claim, absolutely. The document suggests that this kind of energy extraction, maybe driven by consciousness, could potentially explain things that, well, current science struggles with. And interestingly, they draw a parallel here to Eastern philosophy. Concepts describing the vacuum as a kind of fundamental substance like qi or spirit, may be governed by forces like yin and yang.
So it's blending physics and philosophy again.
Exactly. And it's that unexpected mix that makes these documents so, well, compelling for a deep dive like this.
This all seems to point towards what the documents are calling an era of new science, one that actively tries to bring consciousness into the scientific picture. It sounds like the author thinks current physics is missing something big by ignoring it.
That's definitely a central argument. The author argues that mainstream physics, by being purely reductionist, mind is just brain activity, has basically sidelined consciousness, treated it like an irrelevant side effect.
Or just not real in a physical sense.
Right. So this new science wants to fix that. It wants to bring in concepts like virtual energy and really think about how it relates to the matter and energy we do study. For Bald and Bonkers, this potential for a whole new paradigm is why this stuff is so significant.
And that consciousness energy matter triangle comes back here too, but it's described a bit differently. Consciousness is called a virtual energy quantity, existing in a virtual time space, and it acts like a catalyst. What does virtual mean here?
Okay, so virtual here seems to mean something not directly observable or measurable in our normal 3D space plus time. But it still has real effects on that reality.
Like a hidden layer.
Kind of, yeah. A hidden dimension, maybe, where consciousness operates and influences the tangible realms of matter and energy. And the catalyst part suggests consciousness can trigger or guide changes without being used up or changed itself in the process.
The documents go pretty far with this. They talk about reformulating electromagnetics to include virtual electromagnetic waves.
Yes. The idea is that maybe these could explain why some paranormal things seem to violate normal cause and effect, and maybe even offer new ways to transmit information.
Yeah.
That's a fundamental shakeup of how we think about light, radio waves, all that.
It really is. Standard physics relies on causality in our space-time.
Exactly. So introducing virtual waves suggests interactions or information transfer that might bypass those normal constraints.
Yeah.
It could offer explanations for things current physics finds baffling, which is precisely the kind of boundary-pushing thinking Bald and Bonkers seems interested in.
And it doesn't stop there. They also talk about reorganizing Einstein's special relativity using a complex time-space. How does that fit in?
It feels like they're trying to build a whole new theoretical scaffolding, doesn't it? Proposing a complex time space, which mathematically might involve both real and imaginary number components, seems like an attempt to create a more robust framework, one that can actually accommodate this virtual time space where consciousness is supposed to live and interact.
Even thermodynamics gets a makeover. The science of heat and energy.
Yeah, apparently so. The idea of matter forming because of consciousness is linked to entropy changes, the tendency towards disorder. But these changes happen in this virtual medium.
And that needs a new law. Ultra energy conservation. That sounds like rewriting one of the most basic rules of physics.
It's a massive expansion, absolutely. The laws of thermodynamics we know govern energy in our observable universe. Bringing in ultra energy, linking it to consciousness in this virtual medium, implies a much bigger conservation principle, one that covers not just normal matter and energy, but consciousness too.
Quantum mechanics isn't left out either, is it? Something about an external system, matter and energy, interacting with an internal system, consciousness.
Exactly. You know how the observer's role in quantum measurements is still kind of a puzzle?
Sure, the measurement problem.
Well, this reorganization suggests consciousness, as this internal system, isn't just a passive observer. It actively engages with the external system of matter and energy. It implies a much deeper, more direct connection than mainstream quantum theory usually considers.
And we see that energy triangle diagram again, but now Q is labeled Q and called virtual charge, virtual magnetic monopole. It keeps coming back to this virtual charge idea.
It really seems to be a linchpin concept, yes, and calling it a virtual magnetic monopole is interesting, because real magnetic monopoles, just a north pole or just a south pole on its own, have never actually been found.
Right, magnets always come in pairs.
So this theory proposes that this virtual version plays a key role, mediating how consciousness, matter, and energy interact.
Yeah.
Like a hidden go-between.
But the documents admit this is all pretty challenging for mainstream science, right? Especially trying to fit the feeling, the function of consciousness, the spiritus, they call it, into physics equations. It's like mixing oil and water.
It's a huge challenge. How do you quantify subjective experience? It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
These documents are a bold attempt to build that bridge, proposing new fundamental entities and interactions. And that kind of groundbreaking exploration aligns perfectly with what Bald and Bonkers are looking for in this assignment.
Which leads to broadening energy conservation to include ultra energy, basically saying consciousness is a form of energy.
That's the implication, yeah. Consciousness has its own inherent energetic aspect, and its interactions have to follow some bigger conservation law that includes it.
This bit about negative norms in physics is also quite strange. Using quantities with negative values to explain things like electrostatic cooling. That seems counterintuitive.
It does challenge our usual thinking. Normally, mass, energy, they're positive. Introducing negative norms suggests there might be entities or properties that behave in really weird ways. Maybe these invisible quantities could explain phenomena that don't neatly fit current models. They could interact with our world subtly but significantly.
And then they float the idea of unifying electromagnetism and gravity using this virtual magnetic charge, saying maybe the Coulomb force, which pushes charges apart, could be explained by this virtual charge somehow. That would be enormous, a unified field theory.
Absolutely enormous. Unifying gravity and electromagnetism is a holy grail in physics, proposing that a virtual magnetic charge is the key, potentially explaining both attraction and repulsion in one framework. That's incredibly ambitious.
There's also this time catalyst function, linking time slowing down near massive objects to these negative norm magnetic fields, and maybe even explaining why things decelerate. They're trying to connect a lot of dots here.
That's what unified theories aim for, right? A single explanation for seemingly different things. The time catalyst function is another piece of their puzzle, trying to link gravity, time, motion, and these proposed virtual quantities. Again, it's that kind of deep synthesis Bald and Bonkers seems keen on examining.
The documents are pretty explicit about wanting to merge Oriental concepts with Western science, focusing on these virtual quantities that we can't see, but which might be essential for understanding matter and energy. It sounds like a real meeting of worldviews.
It is. It's a call for a more, holistic approach, acknowledging that other traditions might have valuable insights into consciousness and reality. These virtual quantities are the proposed scientific mechanism to bridge those different ways of understanding.
And the section finishes with this mind-bending idea that consciousness might increase cosmic entropy disorder overall. But locally, it implies this passive motion due to gravity and the virtual magnetic charge, which feels different from our experience of consciousness creating order.
It's complex, yeah. It suggests our local perception of consciousness as an ordering force might be just one part of the picture. On the grandest scale, it might play a different role, maybe contributing to the universe's overall heat death, while still being tied into these fundamental gravitational and virtual magnetic interactions.
But the author does stress this is just the framework, right? It's not presented as the final answer. More work, debate, and especially research for actual evidence are needed.
Absolutely. They're very clear about that. These documents lay out a fascinating, provocative conceptual landscape. They challenge assumptions.
Yeah.
But the critical next step, as they say, is turning these ideas into testable predictions and doing the experiments. That forward-looking aspect is definitely something Bald and Bonkers would appreciate us highlighting.
So to kind of wrap up where we've plunged into this really fascinating, definitely unconventional idea of consciousness, matter, and energy being deeply interconnected, maybe interchangeable, held together by this panpsychist consciousness quantity and these modified equations.
Yeah, and we explore the vacuum not as emptiness, but as this active, energetic sea, potentially influenced by consciousness itself.
And examine this call for a new science, one that really tries to integrate consciousness and these virtual phenomena into our basic understanding of how the universe works. And this whole exploration, this deep dive, was prompted by that special assignment from Bald and Bonkers Network, LLC.
Right, which underscores just how potentially disruptive these ideas could be if they turned out to be even partly true. It could genuinely rewrite physics, our understanding of reality, even what it means to be conscious.
Precisely. These theories, they definitely push boundaries. They force us to ask if our current picture is missing something fundamental. Maybe that consciousness isn't just a passenger, but part of the underlying machinery.
That possibility of a unified framework, bridging the objective world and our subjective experience. It's a powerful idea.
So for you, the listener, maybe something to think about as you go about your day. What if that space that seems empty isn't? What if it's, I don't know, humming with potential, with this virtual energy?
And what if your own awareness, your consciousness, isn't just brain chemistry, but something woven into the fabric of reality itself, linked to matter and energy in ways we're only just starting to imagine?
It's definitely something to let simmer. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.